are these people?
So our first story of this evening, more Africa stuff, folks, but we can never get enough of Africa since that's kind of my slight bias. And then we don't hear enough of what's going on there. So any information we do get from Africa, I think is always appreciated. But this is from MintPress. This article, come on, is written by
Ramzy Baroud.
Baroud. Do you know what? I forgot what he does exactly. I
I've
think
seen him
he's
do a ton. So,
okay.
but yeah, he's on MintPress fairly often.
Yeah, so this is an opinion piece that he wrote, where he discusses what the media is not telling us about West Africa. I can almost argue what the media is not telling us about anywhere in the global south. I think this also relates.
MintPress, we leave your article. We leave your logo in the top corner. Just saying. You know what I'm saying?
We give you credit.
Yeah.
We give you credit whenever you do stuff. Shout out to
Ramzy, if you're
MintPress.
watching, after we tag you, just move that on up the ladder, in case they're wondering. But anyway.
And anyways.
Yeah.
And as an aside, there is some French in here, so I have to bust out my
I'll help you out there too.
Very awful French that I have not taken since high school.
Voulez-vous coucher avec moi?
So forgive me. So forgive me if I mispronounce any of these French words. If I mispronounce any of these French words, forgive me. I've not taken French since senior in high school.
Right.
But anyway, what if the epidemic of coups in West and Central Africa is not that at all, but a direct outcome of outright revolutionary movements, similar to the anti-colonial movements that liberated most African nations from the yoke of Western colonialism throughout the 20th century? Whether this is the case or not, we're unlikely to find out anytime soon, simply because the voices of these African nations are essentially and deliberately muted. For us to understand the real motives behind the spate of military takeovers in West and Central Africa, 8 since 2020, we are sadly compelled to read about it in Western media. And that is a significant part of the problem. Western media has failed to convey the deeper social and economic context behind the political upheaval in various African regions. The near complete control over the narrative, however, is deliberate. In a relatively comprehensive description of Oligui Nguema, the new leader of Gabon, the BBC website offered nothing of substance in terms of familiarizing us with the motives behind the military's move against Gabon's corrupt longtime leader, Ali Bongo. Of course, the voice of Lumumba himself was almost entirely absent in the piece. It's difficult and time-consuming to find a cohesive, non-filtered political discourse emanating from Gabon, or Mali, Burkina Faso, or the rest of the African nations undergoing political transitions now. Instead, we find news, information, and opinions, almost all filtered through Western news agencies, politicians, academics, and experts, quote unquote. Even those who may appear to speak nonconformist language tend to feed the stereotype, perpetuating the mainstream perception of Africa. A quick examination of the recent articles on West Africa in the French media reveals an obvious truth. The language deconstructing the recent upheaval demonstrates that no true awakening is underway among the French intelligentsia, even by those who perpetually speak as part of the country's mainstream left. In an interview published on August 30th in Le Point, French author and expert in African studies Antoine Glacier blames the French government for failing to see how Africa has gone global. The article appeared shortly after the Gabon coup, but Glacier's ideas are not new. He has made several references in the past to such failure, including an article in L'Opinion early in August. He argues that France has failed to understand the changing political dynamics in and around Africa and that China, Turkey, and others largely occupied the once tightly French-controlled African markets. But a subtle message is this: Africa evolves, or should always evolve, in France's orbit, and an alternative understanding must be developed by policymakers in Paris to cope with or catch up to the new globalized African politics.
Hmm.
The same sense of entitlement was conveyed in Le Figaro. Isabelle Lasserre, in her article entitled Gabon, oh boy,
La
La
diplomate
diplomate,
français di
not La
Sorbonne.
diplomate, La diplomate française
Hmm.
discassonnée par l'EPIDEMIC des coups d'État en Afrique speaks of bathtub torture of French diplomatics. They
Bathtub
barely
torture,
believe
huh?
that they can get their heads out of the water when a new pluche, I guess that's how you say it,
Yeah.
plunges it back into them
Punch.
even more brutally, she writes.
Yeah.
The
Bathtub torture
brutality
sounds like you'd
referred,
pay extra in France for that, but what do I know?
what's that?
Bathtub torture sounds like you'd pay extra for that in France, but what do I know?
Sure.
Um,
The brutality referenced here is not that suffered by African nations in the painful periods of colonialism, post colonialism, and decolonization, but that of French diplomats. Lasserre references Macron's use of the phrase epidemic of push being another word for coup in German. Not sure if I pronounced that right, but you
mhm.
get the point. It was Macron who popularized the term. It makes Africans appear unruly, sick even. French journalists are now blaming their government for failing to diagnose, let alone remedy, the Pan-African disease. No alternative understanding is possible when the problem is coined in such a way where the blame is squarely on Africans, and the lesser blame of simply failing to understand is placed on France and other Western governments. In Africa, one coup does not drive out another, but adds to the previous one, Lassalle writes. In other words, it is an African-induced chaos, and Europe is suffering and shouldering its consequences, a white man's burden of or sorts.
What? Sorry. What?
Little attention has been made to the possibility that perhaps African countries are fed up with the old apparatus, that of Western supported wealthy and violent dictators and supposed democrats who squandered their country's wealth to remain in power. Gabon is a very rich country in terms of energy resources, lumber, manganese, and iron, but its tiny population of 2.3 million is very poor. This racket of exploitation has been sustained for decades simply because it served the interests of the local rulers
Yep.
and their multinational partners. We're going to get more into that in a few minutes.
Sure.
Whatever means of protest do the people of Gabon, Mali, or others have when mass rallies are violently crushed and the media is tightly controlled, aside, of course, from military coups? This does not seem to be the heart of the matter to many in the French media, primarily concerned about losing their stronghold in Africa to China, Russia, and others. Instead, some in the press are flouting the theory that Africans are impressed with the persona of strongmen of non democratic regimes, a direct reference to Russia and China.
Mm-hmm.
Although the strongman theory has long been discounted, or at least lost its appeal in academic circles, it is often applied in its own form and the ugly insinuations in Western understanding of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. It would make no sense for Africans to reject democracy, one that is based on genuine equality, fair distribution of wealth, ample opportunities, freedom of expression and the press, and all the rest. The only explanation, though often communicated indirectly, is that they all suffered from collective malaise, which complicates the supposed noble mission of Western countries. In truth, many African nations, as demonstrated by the latest popular military takeovers, deeply resent Western governments for the right reasons: their military interventions, economic exploitation, political meddling, and a lingering sense of superiority. Rarely do we hear such alternate views because we are not meant to. The political discourse emanating from West Africa, although largely inaccessible, speaks of a collective desire for a paradigm shift.
Yep.
It is necessary for this fight to go through arms, but also through our values, our behavior, and the recovery of our economy, say Ibrahim Traore, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, who we've talked about a few weeks ago.
Yep.
In his speech late last year, he declared that the right for total independence has begun. A similar sentiment was campaigned by Assami Goita, president of the transition in Mali, when he spoke about the need to regain the nation's dignity in the context of colonial domination. France and other Western countries' experts should fundamentally reconsider their understanding of Africa. They should also diversify their political lexicon to include dignity, values, liberation, and total independence because, clearly, the language of epidemic of coups and other self-serving, convenient phraseology has completely failed.
There's an epidemic of coups. It's contagious somehow that these African countries all hate us right at the same time. It couldn't have anything to do with anything else. Yeah.
Which, I mean, it just makes the case why independent media is important.
Yep.
And especially in the global south. So, like, we know Nico, shout out to Nico, is in Brazil. And I would argue, since he's been in Brazil, he's reported a lot more on international politics since moving there. Friend to the show, Fee, but even when she was in the Convo Couch, has reported quite a bit on issues in Latin America. But I said this, I believe, was it last week, if not 2 weeks ago, it's very hard to try and get sources from Africa that are not necessarily streamlined through Western media.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what makes it difficult, even for my personal to talk about stories.
You have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
We know this, Collin.
Yes.
So that's what they're saying, is that Africa suddenly isn't African if it's not French. What?
Right.
Okay. Nice. I just love the fucking, like, the cojones of, like, Western powers to, like, be this fucking shitty, it's literally like, you love us, we kill you all the time, but love us. It's so funny. We desperately need all of your resources. Please don't hate us. Not that they do anything to actually, like, show their appreciation in any way other than blood and torture and,
So speaking of, great segue. So we got a clip from African Stream, one of our favorite people who we've not heard from in a long time.
Yeah, they do some good stuff.
And one of my top interviews, if we can ever get her on the show, Dr. Africana Chimamori Qual. She was the former African Union ambassador to the U.S. We've played her quite a bit last year, and so we're going to play her now. But she's going to explain why. Well, in this case, she's going to explain why, a lot of these African leaders that were placed from our Western bitches, basically, is directly related to this chronic underdevelopment of the continent that you just spoke of. So again, this is one example of trying to get voices on the ground in terms of what's really happening to kind of counter the Western narrative of what we might hear of Africa if we're lucky to.
Right.
So I'll let her do the talking as to what the reality is.
Cool.
The performance that you're talking about is the performance of what Nigerian minerals are doing to French education, to French healthcare, to French infrastructure. You tell me, why is it that 95% of Nigerian uranium is powering over 30% of France, while over 70% of Nigerians have no electricity? How is that okay? How is even President Bazoum proud of himself with that fact? There is no development in Niamey. I was in Niamey a few years ago when we had the AU summit. It was pitiful to see the level of underdevelopment that Niger has. There is no development in Niger. Let's make no mistake about it. Niger is the second poorest country in Africa, in the world, in fact. So how can President Bazoum be proud of himself? What development is he talking about? You're talking about developing France? There is no development in Niger. One of the poorest countries on earth. And of course, IMF would love them. World Bank would love them. France would love him because he is allowing the pilferage, the exploitation to continue. And that's why the people are rising up to say, if you can't stand up to the bullies and tell them that the exploitation can no longer continue, and look President Macron in the face and say, President Macron, how is it okay that my money, my bank reserves, my natural resources are funding French education, are funding French healthcare, are funding French infrastructure? How is that okay, President Macron? Answer us. Africans in Niger, they want to know. So when you tell me that he is favored by the West, it makes sense. But he's definitely not favored by the people because there is no development. Let's be serious here. Let's stop pushing lies about what's happening. They know the exploitation is happening. It's happening in Niger. It's happening in Burkina Faso. It's happening in Mali. It's happening in every African country. Let's make no mistake about this. We're sick and tired of giving up our lunch to Western nations. African children, they need to eat too. African children need to go to school. African children need good healthcare systems. Behind all that abuse, we need to let the Western world know that there are millions of African children who are going hungry, millions of African children who are dying, millions of women, African women who are dying giving birth to another life, millions of African youth who are unemployed, all because the Western world is continuing with the agenda of exploitation, and exploitation of the African continent. That era is over. Well, and we're coming together as Africans and saying, enough is enough. This has got to stop.
Well, Dr. Arikano would be happy to know my mother has told me about all the starving people in Africa for a long time, especially when I wouldn't eat my vegetables. You know?
Shout out to Nick in the chat, and shout out to you. He commented, I wasn't aware that all the basics that the French have, early retirement, healthcare, etc., is off the backs of Africans. Yeah, like you can make the argument basically in the global South. And I remember Sabby, shout out to her, and actually the next couple of clips I'm going to play kind of relate to this idea.
The performance.
That this is the danger of democratic socialism that Bernie and AOC and the SCA kind of promote.
Yeah,
it's this idea that like it's still capitalism, but kind of more reined in. But if we're doing well, so let's say if and this is something that I think we don't talk about, that I think we should, for having more socialist programs, like if we want even like Medicare for all and all that kind of stuff, we gotta wonder if we're gonna have this stuff, someone's gonna be exploited. So if it's not necessarily us here, then who is? And often that ends up being places in the global South. So anywhere there is even a hint of capitalism, someone is going to get exploited somewhere else. So that's something that we need to consider more. That Africana kind of called out is that the French have healthcare and education off the backs of Africans. And for Africans, it's not even guaranteed that they get any of those things themselves. So just something I think when we do talk about these conversations, we often don't think about the idea of like, there's still this air of capitalism, even for the things here that we talk about that's more progressive, that is still exploiting somewhere else.
Yeah, those resources are from somewhere.
Right. So, but given that, so I'm going to play two clips. I know Sammy and JB have referenced this YouTube channel before, but this is Second Thought.
Yep.
So I'm actually going to play in 2 parts because it's long. It's about 20-minute long video. But I'm going to split into 2 clips where this guy basically talks about, I'm not sure of his name actually, but he's going to talk about how capitalism robs the developing world. So he talks about parts of it in relation to Africa, like pre Atlantic slave trade, essentially, and given how it is now and how it kind of affects within the global South as a whole. So let's play. I forgot actually. This one is probably the shorter one of the 2. So let's play this clip first.
A little bit. Our modern world order and its rich-poor divide is undeniably rooted in the history of slavery and colonialism. While the history of the world is long and diverse, with each area and culture having its own record of the sequence of important events that defines it, a common historical juncture for many places is the white guys showing up and ruining it. That's the case for basically every modern country that's not here, and practically entire continents like Africa, which, despite its incredible diversity of cultures and characteristics, has been pretty uniformly subjected to the violence and damaging effects of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Before the arrival of the Europeans, Africa was a continent with tens of thousands of cultures, some organized in ways that are easily recognizable to modern Western eyes with empire or state-like structures, and others that operated on completely different societal models without a good Western analogy. While the conventional narrative about Africa is one of a backwards continent that was quote-unquote civilized by European colonialism, a horrible and flat-out wrong justification for the atrocities I'll get to in a bit, Africa was actually developing side by side with much of the rest of the world for centuries. Historians note, for example, the advanced agricultural techniques like terracing, crop rotation, green manuring, mixed farming, and regulated swamp farming that made African topsoil rich and fertile for centuries, and the domestication of plants like millet, rice, and yams that was widespread on the continent. While this agriculture was not as productive as that in Europe and Asia, this was probably because land was abundant, and the organization of production around family units instead of feudal lords meant that self-sufficiency didn't require the same maximization that we saw in Europe, which ironically eventually led to the degradation of European soil, where Africa had achieved a more sustainable model. Then there were material goods. While Europe's Industrial Revolution had brought with it an abundance of goods, mass-produced in shiny new factories, especially textiles, African goods like leather, copper, iron, and cloth produced at the same time were praised for their craftsmanship, their durability, and their quality. This is not to say that because it was happening at a smaller scale that Africa did not experience abundance. Like Europe, Africa produced surplus, and used this surplus to trade, with complex economies emerging between the 3 continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa prior to the advent of slavery and colonialism. What I'm trying to say here is that while there were qualitative differences between the countries that are now considered the global north and the global south, it's not always clear that these differences made the global south worse off.
Right. So, for all intents and purposes, and you probably know this anyway if you know your history, like pre colonialism, global south generally, they were doing pretty well. Just different, but it made sense given their climate and cultures, So, okay, so now we're going to go to the next part, the longer part. And as I said, there's a lot that we're cutting out here, but this part I think is just more important in terms of how capitalism has essentially basically has gotten Africa to where it is now, and by association, the global south. So you can go ahead with this one, Reef.
Colonies were often very profitable. According to historian Walter Rodney, in the mid-1950s, British investments in South Africa were estimated at £860 million and yielded a stable profit of 15%, or £129 million every year. Similarly, De Beers Consolidated Mines made a profit that was both phenomenal and consistently high, between $26 million and $29 million throughout the 1950s. In other words, if slavery hadn't driven a big enough wedge between the rich and the poor, colonialism would. But colonialism would eventually end. That is, if you don't count the 17 official colonies still recognized by the UN, like Guam and French Polynesia, or the many more colonies that don't get put on official lists because they make ruling countries uncomfortable. Nonetheless, we have a lot fewer colonies today than we used to. The mid-20th century was a period of success for a number of anti-colonial revolutions. Many countries won their right to independence in these revolutions, and to most, this is where the story ends. It seems like the domination of colonial powers is over. Yeah, Europe screwed over the rest of the world for centuries, but then they stopped. So then, why is there still a gap between rich and poor? Can't all these countries just pull themselves up by their bootstraps? No, it's not just that after years of colonialism and slavery, the West had a head start and the global South had a handicap. When it was forced to relinquish the direct control of colonial rule, the West made sure it would never have to let go of the economic power it had built for centuries. In other words, the formal end of colonialism wasn't really the end after all. Like credits after a Marvel movie, there was more to come. Within a global capitalist economy, burgeoning independent economies were in a tough spot. After decades of being used and exploited, former colonies had very little wealth still in their control. But they needed to trade with the countries that had formerly exploited them for trillions and never paid reparations back. Trade is how most countries can secure basic needs. Enter the IMF, the World Bank, and structural adjustment programs. The IMF, World Bank, GATT, which became the WTO, and even some Western countries directly told newly independent countries that if they wanted to be included in the international economy, and perhaps even get a loan to get them started, they would have to follow a strict set of rules. They would have to drop any tariffs on foreign goods, privatize any national industry, open their country to foreign investment, and in every respect minimize the role of the state. In some
Which is why BRICS has been becoming a thing among African countries. So
Right, but even that is kind of concerning considering that they're trying to model themselves after a lot of these
the
stuff
IMF, right?
and
Granted,
the
it's
World Bank.
way better and gives them way more power in regards to like voting rights, but than the IMF certainly does, which is pretty much all
Right.
U.S. Western decision making. You know,
Right.
with BRICS, it's at least
But
like,
it's-
hey, you get a say, like if you're part of it.
Right.
So,
But given like what we talked about with India, how certain
Yep.
countries have one foot in and one foot to the west,
yeah, that
you
might
know,
be tricky.
that still might be concerning. Even with
Some,
them.
they had to open the doors to unbridled Western capitalism, with pretty awful results. Not only were the loans really for the benefit of Western organizations, a loan has to be paid back with interest after all, the rest of the requirements often had and continue to have devastating effects. These measures ended up inviting many foreign-owned companies into former colonies. Without the ability to level the playing field on international competition with protectionist tariffs, or large-scale investments into national industries, infrastructure, and common goods, Global South countries were taken over by multinational industries. In the forced competition for shrinking export markets that the liberalization of trade produced, the Global South was coerced into turning to Western companies and their direct capture of national resources. Today, as an example, Canadian companies operate 75% of the world's mining companies, many of which are located in Africa and in Latin America. In effect, resources that are located in the Global South and extracted by the workers of the Global South were forcibly opened up to, and ultimately produce profit for, Canadian business interests, not for these exploited countries. This is why the Global South is still so poor. Because it's not just Canada. In just about every country in the Global South, in almost every economic sector, unprocessed natural resources leave the country's borders, extracted by low-wage workers. They're then processed in the Global North into manufactured products, which in turn are sold back at a higher price to meet the Global South's basic needs. Resources and profits go out, expensive goods and foreign companies come in. Colonialism by the state has been largely recycled into colonialism by businesses and their friendly international institutions. One 27-year-old Cuban lawyer described how this process worked out in Cuba in the 1950s. A country that was no longer a colony of either Spain or the US, but still very much felt like it was. 85% of the small farmers in Cuba pay rent and live under the constant threat of being dispossessed from the land that they cultivate. More than half of the best cultivated land belongs to foreigners. In Oriente, the largest province, the lands of the United Fruit Company and West Indian Company join the north coast to the southern one. There are 200,000 peasant families who do not have a single acre of land to cultivate to provide food for their starving children. We export sugar to import candy. We export hides to import shoes. We export iron to import plows. In short, what the structural adjustment programs and the international capitalist economy offered the Global South was predatory inclusion. Exclusion from international trade could have been deadly to these countries impoverished by centuries of extraction, violence, and exploitation. So even a deal that sucked and pulled profits to the Global North was often sold as better than the alternative. While some of these programs have been accompanied by economic growth in the Global South, it is a much smaller growth than reflects the work done by poor countries, since most of the profit leaves for the North. And what growth does stay domestic mainly falls into the hands of the Global South's wealthy who willingly collaborate with foreign companies for a cut of the profit. Today, these practices continue in full swing. Colonialism never really went away. In summary, the poverty of the world today is not an accident. It's the product of centuries of subjugation to imperialist forces, at the root of which was the need for capitalism to expand beyond the borders of Europe, and the means to inflict tremendous violence on the poor. That this system continues today is no accident. It's what makes the rich and powerful more money. As long as there is no economic challenger strong enough to end this system, capitalism will continue to rob the poor for the benefit of the wealthy.
Yep. Makes sense to me.
Shout out to Second Thought for that. But yeah, so as I said, we're talking about Africa, but I mean, that's the information that you're not going to necessarily hear. You know, it's still poor given it's colonialism, as he said, through business versus,
Yeah.
you know, like back in the day, slavery. And again, he mentioned that, but I cut that out for time, and most of us know that history anyway. So, but yeah, so, but I do think though that's something we definitely need to kind of talk about. I think more on the left is how we can make a lot of our, if we're thinking more progressively in terms of having policies that really are more socialistic in tone, how are we able to um, make it stand for themselves without the idea of having to exploit others in order for us to gain
Yeah.
those benefits?
Which I do see
Um,
that conversation happening among Eastern powers for sure. But
right.
you know, it's they seem to be the only ones wanting to communicate that. So
Right.
compared to Western powers, European powers who just are like, shut up and let us exploit you. You know? So
And we benefit off of your suffering.
yeah.
So yeah, I do think, yeah, I think that's definitely something.
Well,
I think moving forward that we don't consider that at all. And I think really on the left generally, I think and I think that's just due to our culture, you know, that we're just so isolated from the rest of the world. We tend not to think about these things. We don't think about, you know, where we get our food or where we get our clothes. You know, we just see it and not consider the labor and the exploitation that does happen over many of the things that we have in our homes right now.
yeah.
And but I think if we want to be serious about, if we wanted to have these policies like Medicare for all and like a living wage and all of that, you know, we got to think about the idea of like, how can we make sure that, like in Africa, especially in West Africa, that they're able to develop in the way that they should, that is truly democratic.
Well, if you're watching the clip, join that conversation in the comments below. Let us know what you think.